Hey all, this week we're going to be looking at two different things. We're going to be using this lung case right here to introduce you to static IMRT planning. We're also going to plan it 3D so we can compare that 3D plan to that static IMRT plan, and hopefully we're going to all learn an important lesson, and I'll go over that kind of at the end of the video. But to get started, we have this PTV here, this right lower lung PTV. All right, we'll start with the 3D plan. Okay, it's right-sided, very right-sided. So I'm going to probably use, if I was doing this 3D, maybe 5 beams. Since we're going to compare this to IMRT, we might do a couple more, 5 to 7. The first thing I like to do when I'm putting on beams for either a 3D plan, a static 3D plan, or a IMRT plan is look at the shape of the PTV. So I'm going to look for any sharp edges or flat sides or just stuff like that that I know I want to use when selecting. So like this slice right here is kind of elongated in this shape, so I know I'm probably going to want a beam coming this way, things like that. If we look over here, our target kind of runs in this line, so it almost makes me want to throw on a couch kick, right? A non-coplanar beam to kind of match the slope of the target in this plane. We probably won't do that, but that's just an example. Those are the things I'm looking at with the shape of my PTV. And of course, the other thing to look at is your OARs. What OARs are surrounding your target? What do you want to avoid? We're going to try to avoid the heart as much as possible. We want to avoid as much healthy lung as possible. We have the esophagus here, of course the cord, and the bronchus. You can avoid some hot spots at least in that bronchus. Okay, let's throw on our beams. I'm going to label this 3D. For lung cases, usually, well, I shouldn't say usually, but a lot of clinics out there still like to only use 6x for lung. The reason is, a lot of people think that 6x is a little bit more accurate in lung tissue in that interface. Okay, so I won't get into that too much, but we'll just stick with 6x for this plan too. All right, my first angle, when I do have this this very right or left sided, very lateral target, I still do like to have a beam that crosses 0. So that comes from the contralateral side a little bit. It'll just help with your coverage on that medial side. So I am gonna have one beam about right there. So we're going for a very conformal plan, 3D conformal plan. So I want several beams. I want to spread them out so I can get that nice conformal dose distribution. The side of this PTV is kind of flat. We really want to avoid the heart. So I'm going to put this beam kind of over here to match the shape of my PTV, but also in a way that will avoid that heart really well. The best way to avoid our healthy lung tissue is to have a really lateral beam, right? So we can cut high dose out of our lung, anterior and posterior to our target. So I'll probably just do about 270 over here. maybe something like that. Might do just a straight posterior. Kind of was dragging the wrong beams around. To move this one back up here. Might do one more. Again, I'm gonna cross 180 now down here, just to come from that contralateral side a little bit, improve my medial coverage. Gonna try to stay off the cord though. Maybe something like that. So the more beams you put on, obviously the harder it gets to kind of look at here, but a couple things. We're doing a 3D IMRT comparison. To keep that comparison as fair as possible, we're going to use these same exact angles for our 3D plan and our IMRT plan. If this was just 3D, and depending on your prescription and everything, maybe you would cut out one or two of these beams. But again, since we're trying to do a fair comparison, I'm going to leave all 6 of these beams in. We'll weight them, accordingly in our 3D plan. If, a lot of times when I'm doing a 3D conformal plan like this with static beams or even IMRT, a lot of times I am trying to introduce a couch kick. That's one of the really good benefits of static IMRT, is you can a lot more easily than VMAT introduce a non-coplanar beam arrangement. You can rotate your couch a different amount depending on clearance and stuff like that. So, and then you can keep some of your beams coplanar, right? That's one of the main benefits, I think, of static IMRT is the ability to kick the couch. So a lot of times I would be trying to do that. For this comparison, just to make it simpler, we're going to leave it coplanar, but keep that in mind when you're doing static IMRT. Kicking the couch is a big benefit. Okay. All right, let's throw our blocks on. I'm going to start with just a standard 1/2 cm. Something like that. Another big benefit of static IMRT is the ability to rotate your collimator. So depending on how, depending on some of your OARs, let's turn on the esophagus and the heart. Do you want your MLCs coming from the top, the bottom, sides, some other angle? In this case, I want it to be able to block out the heart, so leaving our collimator at 0 makes sense. Kind of same thing for this, but you have the ability to rotate your collimator independently for each field, right? You can have different collimator for each field. It's another nice benefit of static IMRT over VMAT. VMAT, you can only pick, one collimator angle for that arc. Static, you can choose different ones. So I'm going to leave them all at 0 now, but again, when you're planning this clinically, feel free to rotate that collimator angle. Definitely do it if you think it'll help your plan. We're going to do 200 times 30 for this case. I'm going to calculate. complaining about the couch I have in here. I'm just going to delete it. Let's normalize to our standard 95% coverage and take a look, okay? The first thing you're going to want to do for a 3D conformal, which we talked about all last semester, is adjust your weighting, your field weighting. All right, let's take a look at some of our OAR doses here. The heart is pretty low. Mean dose is less than 10. It's pretty good for a case like this. Esophagus, max is 18. That's very low, pretty good. Let's look at our total lung, B20. It's right about 20. It's pretty good too. Mean is only 11.6. Cord, max 21. All these doses are really pretty good. So we don't really have to worry about meeting any constraints. We're just going to focus on, coverage, conformality. If we can weight one of these beams differently to lower the dose to an OAR further, you should do that, okay? So when you're meeting all your constraints, and this is true for 3D, IMRT, VMAT, when you're meeting all your constraints, you should focus on those things. Conformality, you want your dose distribution homogeneous, so no cold spots, no hot spots. And, if you can lower dose to an OAR without affecting those two things, conformality and, the homogeneity, you should. All right. So if I look at my dose distribution, this 42 line kind of sticks out to me, kind of extends posteriorly a bit. Let's open up our beam weighting. Field 5 and 6 are where that's coming from. So, we can lower the dose coming from 5 and 6 a little bit. Got a little better. Field 2, we probably want a little bit lower weight on field 2 anyways, just because it's blowing through, the heart, esophagus, all that. Lower field 2 a little bit. Field 1 and field 4, you can increase a bit. And I'm just looking at the conformality of some of these lower lines, right? Trying to get it to look a little better. Maybe something like that. So after you do your field weighting, the other trick that I've shown you before, but I'll show you again, is I like to adjust my blocks depending on the dose distribution. So we start with that standard 0.5. I'm now going to turn my 100% line on in 3D and my PTV in 3D, and I'm going to, iteratively go through all these beams and adjust that margin. So on this side, that 6,000 line is extending outside of my PTV quite a bit, so I'm going to shrink that margin over here. Over here, medially, we're cold, so I'll increase that margin a little bit. And I'm going to cheat and do kind of a couple at a time here. Usually I would do one at a time, but to try to make this video a little bit more reasonably long, let's do 2 at a time. And you can see every time I do that, you know, that 100% cloud does change. It is getting better. Again, to reiterate, I'm just trying to improve my conformality of that 100% line. So where we're cold on our PTV, want that 100 line to get bigger, right? I want it to cover better where we're cold, so I'm opening up my block where that 100 line is already covering very well. In fact, too well, it's extending outside our PTV. I'm shrinking that block margin in order to tighten that 100 line up. All right. Usually I will do this process, you know, a couple times. I'll go in a circle a couple times, and you can really improve your conformality by doing that. I highly suggest people do that. A lot of times when you're doing 3D planes like this, you might not have a PTV volume. So if you don't have a PTV and you're just expanding on a CTV or GTV, you don't want to do this because you're using that block margin you're building in kind of that PTV in with your block margin, right? But when you have a PTV and that setup margin, that internal margin and stuff like that are already built into your volume, then you can do something like this. You can adjust those block margins for each of your fields to get your plane a little bit more conformal, okay? All right, after you do that, of course, it's time to start planning. So I'm going to try to get rid of a lot of this 105, okay? I'm going to turn 105 on in 3D. I'm going to just quickly go through all my beams to get a sense of you know, which beams are going to work out best for blocking, okay? So I'm looking for beams that I can block that 105 out but leave a considerable amount of field open, right? So this is probably a good field to add a field and field to. This field would not be a good field to add a field and field to, right? I'd have to block out the whole field, you know, to block out this 63 gray line that I'm trying to get to go away. So field 2, no. Field 1, definitely. Okay, so I'm blocking that out. I'm going to add my usual 3%. 3% might not be enough for this case since we have 6 fields. So yeah, 3% only adds, you know, 2.3 MU. Usually like to be at least at 3 MU or more. So maybe, so let's do 4% for all our field and fields. And the other thing to look at is, you know, is that enough to even do anything? So if we go back to 0 real quick. Watch that 105 cloud. You know, it does shrink a little bit, so I'm going to leave it at 4. I know field 2 I don't want to add one to. Field 3 we probably could. Let's do it. So again, I'm just starting at the top. I'm going to go in circles and add my field and fields to fields that make sense to add one to. So on this field, 4% is, you know, only 2.4, so maybe we need to do 5. There we go. And again, is it doing anything? it's not really doing much. The max dose is going down. So 73.58 to 73.28. Looks like the cloud gets maybe a little bigger. So that tells me that maybe the eclipse is having to normalize down a little bit in order to maintain this coverage. So we'll have to keep an eye on that. Maybe field 3 is not a field we want to add many field and fields to. Field 4 we definitely do not want to add one to. Field 5, yes. Looks like we can. Only 2 MU, so we need a little bit more. All right. Field 5 is probably going to be a good one to add field and fields to. Field 6. So again, just to go back to the very, very beginning, the whole point of field and fields, we're trying to reduce the total number of MU going to parts of the plan that have too much dose, right? We're just blocking that out for a certain percentage of the beam on time. We're leaving it open where the plan is on the cooler side, right? So we're just trying to even out the dose, make it more homogeneous. If you just remember that simple fact when you're 3D planning, life will be easier. I think people just kind of forget to think of that basic idea a lot of times. Okay, so it is getting smaller. So I kind of have an idea of which fields to add the majority of our field and fields to. It's going to be field 1. That seems to make a positive impact. Field 5 and field 6. Field 3, I don't know, maybe later on in the process, but in the beginning, it's going to be mostly those 3 fields. It's also important to keep in mind we're trying to block out the 105, which is pretty aggressive, especially for a lung plan like this. I say that because we're delivering dose to the lung, right? The lung, very low density. It can be difficult to get high dose into lung tissue sometimes. Sometimes lungs, you have to let them be a little hotter just to get coverage, especially on the edges in that lung tissue. All right, let's bump this up a little bit just to make this process go a little faster. Again, the lower the percentage you put on your field and fields, the more field and fields you have to add, but the higher the resolution, right? Because you have more field and fields, so the smoother your dose distribution, the better your plan will look. But you have to balance that with time, right? You want to be an efficient planner too, so you'll learn when to up this and stuff like that. For this video, again, so that it's not too long, I'm gonna speed up a little bit, add a little bit more weight to some of these field and fields. So this is only 105, right? So I'm not terribly worried if I get rid of all that 105. It's going to start spilling out on me probably a little bit like this. As long as I see this max dose number coming down, though, I'm going to be happy. I'm just going to keep going in circles. If this 105 starts to spill out on me too much, I will probably turn on the 107 line. Start to worry more about that. Field 1, I think appears to be the best field to add these fill-in fields to, so I'm gonna add 2 to field 1. So we look here, what's happening is you can see when I add weight to this field and field, this cloud of 105 gets a little smaller, but over here gets a little bigger. Watch when I do it. See that? That's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Because what we're doing is we're cooling off that hot spot. We're cooling off the area of the plane that's too hot. When I do that, I lose a little bit of coverage on my PTV over here, and so the Eclipse has to normalize the entire plan down a little bit to get coverage, right? So what happens is our total MU goes up, it heats the whole plan up in general, so this area over here gets a little hotter, but this is the side of the plan that's cold, right? So we're just evening out that dose distribution, right? Which is good. The really hot part of our plan is getting cooler. The colder part of our plan is getting warmer. Hopefully our conformality is improving at the same time as our homogeneity, right? So hopefully that makes sense. Let's just take a look really fast at our plan. I just added a lot of field and fields without checking our dose distribution. It's definitely a good idea every 2 or 3 field and fields you add to scroll through, make sure you're happy with what's going on with your dose. So you can see here what we're doing is we're heating up kind of this medial side as we add our field and fields and cooling down this lateral side, right? But everything's looking pretty good so far, so we'll keep going. I just did field 6. Let's do field 1. Do another field 1. All right. So since our 105, is 105 volume is kind of getting larger on this medial side now than the lateral, I am going to look at our 107 is 6420 to 107. Yes, so let's turn off 105. Let's focus on our 107, right? A lot smaller volumes. So over here, I bet we can get rid of by just slightly adjusting one of these other field and fields. We're going to ignore that for now. Let's look at field 3. Let's try to add another to field 3, see what happens. So it worked. I mean, it got smaller, but definitely got bigger over here. Oops, I forgot to add weight to 6.3. We'll just delete it. Just delete that. So we're below 110, so that's good. Let's just see what happens when we add one or two more though. All right, got rid of all that. So now over here. So again, this is the medial side. This is the side that is cold of our PDV that is cold, or at least was originally cold when we started planning. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through some of these earlier field and fields that were a little bit, that are bigger, right? And I bet there's going to be a couple that we can just slightly adjust, like this one, in order to block out that 107 cloud. Hopefully get it to go away like that. See, so I'm just having to make small adjustments to these previous field and fields that I made instead of making a brand new one and traveling through a lot of our PTV volume that's already on the cooler side that we don't want to block out anymore, right? It's another just tip. When you finish up, can just go through all your field and fields, make tiny adjustments rather than add new ones. So we got rid of all the 107, our hotspots under 107. Let's turn all our lines on again. All right, I think this plan looks pretty good. Let's check our conformality real quick. 1.1. Pretty good for 3D, you know. It's a smaller volume. It's not round though, you know. Really it's pretty good. 1.1 is pretty good. Our hotspot's under 107. We have 95% coverage. So our homogeneity is pretty good too. Our OERs are definitely very good. Everything is passing any you know, standard constraint. So I'm happy with this plan. All right. Now let's compare what we just went through to what it would take to come up with a static IMRT plan. Okay. So I'm just going to copy this. Call IMRT. I'm going to uncalc it. Delete all our field and fields. Alright, so we have our same 6 fields, same angles, same collimator angles, all of that. Same dose. Now let's get into a IMRT plan. So when I'm choosing my angles and things like that, you know, I'm thinking of the same things as I am when I'm doing my 3D plans, you know, is in terms of collimator angles. What directions do I want my MLCs to come from? What do I think is going to be easier on the optimizer in order to block out certain OARs or get good coverage or get more conformal on my PTV, things like that. So you can definitely have a different collimator angle on each beam. All right, in this case, I'm just leaving it at 0, but definitely look at that. All right, you can introduce non-coplanar beam arrangements, so couch kicks if you think that'll help. Just watch your clearance, right? But the good thing is you could introduce a couch kick on just one beam if you want to, right? If a certain beam angle is you don't want to kick it because you're worried about clearance, then don't. You know, just do it on the ones that you can and think will help. And then, you know, look at the OARs you want to block and look at the shape of your PTV and use those two things to kind of determine what gantry angles to pick. All right. Once you're happy with all that, your beam arrangement, we're going to come in here to the optimizer. Whoops, I need to delete my MLCs. Can't have MLCs added to fields. There we go. All right, once you're in the optimizer, I'm not going to discuss the X smoothing value and the Y smoothing value right now. That could be a whole separate video, okay? The default is 40 for X, 30 for Y. 9 times out of 10, I'm just leaving that, okay? Some people are really good at adjusting these numbers though and can get some really good plans by adjusting these numbers. I'm not going to get into that though. Maybe in a different video. But what I did want to show you right now is this fixed jaw option. If you have something really important that you're trying to just completely avoid, like a pacemaker, you know, a prosthetic, something like that, you can set your jaws however you want them to be. So if you can set your jaws and lock them basically. If you check this, now the optimizer cannot move my jaws at all, right? It just is what it is. Obviously you got to be careful of that. You want to make sure you have a good look, a good view of your PTV from at least a few of your beams, right? And you don't want to accidentally leave your jaws too big or too small in some of your fields, things like that. But it is an option, all right? We're gonna leave that off so that the optimizer can choose our jaw settings and move them if it wants to. What I like to do for VMAT or IMRT is I will add my targets first and only my targets. On the GTV, I'm going to do slightly over prescriptions. Let's do 6100. PTV 6000. So 100% at our prescription dose, 0% at 105, 105%. For IMRT specifically, I'm going to uncheck both of these options and click Start. So another nice benefit of IMRT planning is that it's very fast. The optimizer is very, very fast, all right? And you can see here, it very quickly got us good coverage. The only other constraint that I have turned on is this NTO down here. This is the default automatic with a priority of 100. Again, I'll get into the NTO a little bit more in later videos. But basically, it's working on conformality. It's trying to get our plan to be conformal. All right. So as soon as this converged, it's not a button, but looks like a button. As soon as this turns green like this right here, that means the optimizer is kind of done, right? It's not coming up with anything better. You either need to make a change over here or just click OK or stop or something, because it's not going to do much as soon as it is converged like this. But okay, so I like to start by getting my coverage like this. I think it's even more important to do it like this in IMRT planning than VMAT planning, because your beam arrangement matters quite a bit more for IMRT than VMAT. VMAT, you just have a lot more looks no matter what you're doing. IMRT, your plan will change drastically depending on what angles you use, what colorment angles, all of that type of stuff, right? So I like to know that I can get good coverage, that I can get a conformal plan, that I can get rid of hotspots, all that right away before I even start to mess with my OARs. So if my plan does not look good right now, just from a coverage standpoint, I know I need to go adjust my beam angles, okay? And a lot of times I would say over half the time I will do that. I will hop in here quick, turn this on, see what my dose looks like on, those more difficult plans. A lot of times I'm like, oh, I don't like how it's streaking over here or this or that, and I will adjust and try different angles until I've really finalized what beam angles I want to use. But if you're happy with how this looks, second thing I do is start adding all my OARs in, okay? So let's just add, like we found in our 3D plan, all these OAR doses are pretty low. When they're really low like this, and I'm just seeing if I can lower the dose even more, a lot of times I will add this upper GEUD with an alpha value 1, which is just the mean dose, right? So it started about 500. I put 400 here just to see if, the optimizer can easily lower the dose anywhere in the esophagus. I'll do the same thing for the heart. It's at 850 now. Let's put 750 in here. This is the relationship I always start with. So 100% on my targets, 50 on my OARs. It's hard to get in trouble with that relationship. It's also just, it works. It's a good starting point. So whatever you put as your targets, if you just put half that in for your OARs, it's a good starting point. You can see, the mean dose did come down 60 centigrade for my esophagus, come down about 50 for my heart. So it did come down a little bit. Liver's very low. Cord is very low. Trachea is very low. Let's just focus on our lungs. So a lot of times you're looking at your V20, so the volume receiving 20 gray. Let's see if we can get that any lower. put an upper constraint just under that point on my DVH with 50. If you look really close, I mean, the line is kind of barely moving. But you can see right after I put that in, it goes back to converged right away. That means it's just, you know, it either thinks it's doing a really good job already, or it just can't do what you're asking it to do. So to kind of test that out, we can increase our priority a bit. It is definitely coming down, right? And our coverage doesn't seem to be suffering, no hotspots, anything like that. Just to talk really quickly about these down here, these two graphs are showing us the same thing. It's just, it's a graph of our objective function. So each of these OARs is contributing to the total objective function of the optimizer right here. Basically, it's telling us, you know, you can think of it, it's not exactly how it works, but you can think of it kind of like as the total computational power, okay? Out of a scale of 100, for example, if we hover over here, it says the cost function of this objective is 7%. So 7%, the total like computational power is going towards this constraint right here. So it's not working very hard on this constraint, either because it's needing to work on a different constraint a lot more, or in this case, it's really close to meeting that constraint. So it thinks it's doing a good job, right? It doesn't need it. If you want this area of the DVH, if we want it to do better on this constraint right here, basically we need to keep up in the priority. Or if we want it to do something different, we can pull it down like this. So when I pulled it down, the optimizer all of a sudden realized, oh, it's not very close to meeting that constraint, right? Because I pulled it down. That line is further from that point. So that cost function goes up, starts working harder on meeting that constraint. And as it improves the plan, as it does get closer to meeting that constraint, that cost function will go down. So you can see it spiked when I moved it, because it went from doing very good on that constraint to poorer because I moved it. But then it starts to find new MLC patterns, find new solutions for meeting that constraint. So the cost function goes down, right? And you got to just remember, it's a big balancing act, right? It's trying to, based on the information you give it, the optimizer is trying to come up with the best plan that it can. Again, based on the information you provide. So based on these priority numbers and the constraints you're putting in, it's trying to move those MLCs, come up with new MLC patterns. In the case of IMRT, it's dealing with fluence right now. It's coming up with fluence patterns from each of these beams in order to find the best compromise, you know, amongst all these constraints to come up with the best plan. If you notice, it's not meeting exactly any of these constraints, right? And that's just how the optimizer works. It will not do exactly what you tell it to do almost ever. So like in this case, I'm wanting the V20 to go down, so I'm putting that objective below the line, trying to just pull the line. So you almost always have to go slightly beyond what you are actually wanting, and then you know, adjusting your priority levels and your constraints from there. Throughout this entire semester, we'll dive very deep into, you know, how to do that. When should you drag an objective down versus when should you just up the priority, things like that, okay? But anyways, hopefully out of this you got that one of the benefits of IMRT is that it's very, very fast. The optimizer is very, very fast. I've been talking a lot, but you can see how flat these lines are. It very quickly comes up with its solution. You can optimize these plans in just a few minutes. It's very, very fast. And that's why I uncheck these two boxes. If you leave these two checked, as soon as the optimizer is converged, it will do what you have checked here. So it'll either convert intermediate dose or calculate intermediate dose right away, or if you choose automatic, it will just stop optimizing, exit, calc final dose right away, which I'll show you right now. So as soon as I check that box, because it's already converged, it's going to calculate intermediate dose. Intermediate dose is very useful for lung cases because you have that big change in density. You can see when it did that, if you guys saw that, we lost a lot of coverage, right? Because it did that more accurate dose calculation, it noticed actually didn't have quite the coverage that we thought we did. So it kicks it back into the optimizer in order to hopefully fix that issue after doing that intermediate dose calc. Again, it gets to be converged right away. So as soon as I click automatic optimization mode, it kicks it out. And it's going to calculate final dose right now. So for IMRT is a little different than VMAT. In the optimizer, it's actually not looking at MLC patterns, it's looking at fluence patterns. So it's only optimizing fluence. And then when you're done with the optimizer and you get out of it like here, that's when it's converting that fluence pattern into an MLC pattern. It's trying to come up with an MLC pattern that will create that fluence that it came up with in the optimizer. All right. Let's see how it did. So our hotspot is just over 110. So we probably would want that to come down a little bit. But you can see that's normalized down 5%. So a common mistake I see people make when optimizing both IMRT and VMAT is always normalizing the coverage they want and then just looking at the hotspot and saying, oh, my plan is too hot. Too hot. Everyone wants to say everything's too hot, which right now it is too hot. But if we put the normalization back at 100 and look at here, the plan's actually, you could also say it's really cold, right? The plan is very cold, where I said it would be in the lung tissue, right? These lung plans are just sometimes hard. It's hard to get that high dose into lung tissue because the density is very low, right? It's hard to get dose there. So it's a common issue. So you could say this plan is cold, as well. I like to kind of deal with both of those issues at the same time. So this needed to go all the way down to 95% in order to get our standard 100 covering 95% coverage. I'm going to just take it down a couple percent to 98. I'm going to create two lines here. I'm going to turn my 107 line into a contour. Well, it's really small. So if I normalize down 2%, our hotspot's just over 107. So I'm going to do something a little bit less. Let's do, 6,400. All right, so that basically creates a contour of our hotspots in our plan. Okay, we're going to use that in the optimizer. I'm also going to turn my 100% line into a contour. All right, so our 100% line, 6,000, turn that into a contour. I'm going to come here to contouring. I'm going to now take this 100% line and come here to crop structure. I'm going to crop my PTV. I'm going to remove parts extending inside of that line. So what that should do is should take our PTV minus the 6,000 line. So it's going to leave behind all of the parts of the PTV that are cold, right? So these parts on the outside, you should leave that behind. So I'm going to click apply, and it does that. Okay, so now we have a contour, we have a contour of all the cold parts of our PTV. So we have the hot contoured, we have the cold contoured. Now I can hop in here and I can use both of those contours in the optimizer. So I'm going to add a lower to that, all the cold area. I'm going to tell it to get 6,000. I'm going to tell the hotspot to get 105. And again, 100 on my priority. I'm going to click start. I'm not going to check these again because it'll just go super fast. I'm going to continue the previous optimization. Now, one of the reasons why this works, it's the same constraint that I already have on the PTV, right? The difference is, if we look at this PTV, the volume is 217 cc's basically. And the cold area was only 18 cc's, so roughly 10%. So the difference is on this constraint right here, 106,000, 90% of the volume is meeting this constraint. So the cost function on this constraint won't be very high. Whereas this one, at least right when I added it in the beginning, the cost function will be very high because almost 0% of this volume is meeting the constraint, right? So it's just kind of a percentage deal, right? That's why it works really well. And it'll give you a lot better control over, your dose. It's another reason why when I have multiple target volumes, instead of making a total PTV and using that in the optimizer, I will use all those different separate PTVs, those smaller volumes, because it's just going to give me more control over what's happening when I'm in here in the optimizer. Same exact thing for this hotspot, right? 0% of this hotspot was meeting this constraint, so it's definitely going to cool that area down, right? Compared to this one. You can see now in the optimizer, everything looks really pretty again. We got our coverage back. Hotspot went away. We'll see when we let this finish up if that holds true after the final dose calc. Again, another benefit, this final dose calc for IMRT is very fast. Everything associated with IMRT, much, much quicker than VMAT. Normalize to our coverage, much, much better. So now our hotspot is somewhere 107.9. So a lot better. Our plan only had to normalize down, 0.8%. That means those cold spots went away. If we look at our plan, looks pretty good. All right. So now let's just think about the differences between 3D and IMRT. Difference number one, much quicker to create that IMRT plan, right? The software is doing all the work for us. What else though? Let's look at our conformality, 0.97. So that is much better. So the 3D plan was 1.1. We're normalized to the same coverage for both plans. So the 3D was 1.1. That means that we had quite a bit of dose spilling into outside of our PTV, right? This IMRT plan, we're only telling it to get 95% coverage. Our conformity is 0.97, so that means it's spilling out a little bit, but not very much. if, well, I don't want to do it right now, but you know, we're not telling it to get 100% coverage. So our conformality, if it was perfect, would be 0.95. So it's very close to being perfect, to 0.95, right? So conformality will almost always be better with IMRT, obviously. Just makes sense. The reason is, if we look at our MLC pattern here, watch this MLC pattern. So this is called a sliding window delivery. It's called that for obvious reasons. These MLCs slide from one side of the PTV to the next. All right, and the speed changes depending on what what fluence pattern the optimizer came up with, right? We cannot do this with our 3D plan, right? The other option you have, let me recalc our leaf motions, but this time let's do, so Varian calls it multiple static segments in here. Another popular name for it is step and shoot. But this essentially now is, oh, I could have just clicked this button too down here to change all of them. But anyways, this now will be similar to field and fields, okay? But with one big difference, which I'll show you here in a second. So now if we look at field 1, instead of that sliding window delivery, it's multiple static segments, exactly like our field and fields, okay? So each one of these MLCs are going to move, stop, and then it's going to deliver dose, stop, MLCs move to a new pattern, deliver dose, like that. Exactly the same as our 3D, but these patterns, there's a lot more of them, all right? And they are a lot more complicated in shape compared to our 3D. So if you think about it, I mean, theoretically, you could get the same plan that we have here with IMRT. You could get the same plan with 3D. It would just take forever. Practically, it's not possible. It's just unreasonable. It would take too long to figure out how to replicate those patterns, those field and fields for all these beams, right? So IMRT, I mean, is definitely going to look a little bit better, right? But let's just take a little bit deeper dive. If we compare our 3D plan to our IMRT plan side by side, if we scroll through here, they look very similar, okay? That's really a main point that I want to try to get by with this video before we dive really deep into VMAT and IMRT. The IMRT is a little bit more conformal with these low isodose lines, right? When we look at the conformality number, in our dose statistics, it's more conformal in our high dose lines too. So it is definitely more conformal. But is it a huge difference. No, it's not a huge difference. If we look at our DVH, it becomes even less apparent. These PTV lines almost right on top of each other. If we look at our other lines, the square is our 3D. So the esophagus dose is actually lower on our 3D. Could I jump into the optimizer again and get that esophagus to match that 3D plan? Yes, I could. But the point is that 3D, is not doing worse than IMRT. If we look at lungs, IMRT is better. IMRT is just able to get more conformal than we were able to get with our 3D plan. So, that our V20 is 5% lower. Oh, maybe about 5% lower. That is probably statistically significant, right? So that is a big improvement. But is our 3D still very much meeting, normal constraints? Absolutely. We were probably like less than 1% away from getting it lower than 20%. We probably could do that with 3D, right? If we tweaked it a little bit more. Heart, again, they're like right on top of each other, not much difference there. Cord, again, about the same. So what I wanted to just get across, hopefully to you guys right away, is that VMAT, IMRT, things like that, you can do some very cool things, and definitely a lot of times VMAT, IMRT is necessary to do those things. Again, just from the basic fact of what we talked about, right? An optimizer can do a lot more complicated MLC shapes than we practically could ever do with 3D, right? And for complicated PTV shapes, especially if the PTV concaves in, imagine like a kidney bean shape, right? It has that concave in. You cannot get your dose to conform to a shape like that with 3D. But with IMRT and VMAT, you definitely can, right? So definitely VMAT and IMRT are necessary for a lot of cases, but there are also a lot of cases where 3D can do just as good. I just want to get that across. I don't want you guys to, forget about 3D conformal planning. It's still a very high quality option, okay? And so if you're in the clinic and IMRT is denied, don't let that be the end of the road or the end of the world. Start experimenting with 3D. You might surprise yourself and be able to get a very high quality plan still with 3D, okay? All right, that's all I have for you this week. Your assignment will be to do a 3D versus IMRT comparison, just like we did. I will have some constraints that you'll be trying to meet for both cases, all right? And, I just want you to walk through it yourself and see what you can make happen with IMRT that you can't with 3D. But on the flip side, what about IMRT? Like, what can't you do with IMRT compared to 3D? It's not magic, I guess, right? So be looking for that. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of your week.